The fog came before the cold. It rolled across the valley floor like something deliberate, thick, white, swallowing tree lines and ridge crests and the distant silhouettes of ruined structures that nobody had bothered to name. By the time Bravo fire team reached the insertion point at 0340 hours, the winter fog had already consumed the world. There was no horizon, no depth, nothing but the sound of boots punching through frozen crust and the low, mechanical breathing of soldiers wrapped in layers they hoped were thick enough. Sergeant First Class Derek Hollis stopped at the tree line and held up a fist. The column went still. 7 soldiers, 7 faces behind scarves and goggles, 7 heartbeats that, for a single beat, synchronized in the silence. Hollis swept his NODs across the open ground ahead. Nothing resolved. The thermal smeared everything into gray ghosts, heat signatures blurred by the moisture-heavy air. He lowered the device and exhaled, and his breath became part of the fog. "This is it," he said. His voice was clipped, controlled, the voice of a man who had spent 11 years making fear sound like planning. "We hold the ridge. We observe. We do not engage unless engaged. Copy?" A chorus of low affirmatives. Most of them sounded steady. One did not. Private First Class Cody Ramirez was 19 years old and had been in theater for 6 weeks. He was from Tucson. He had a sister named Grace who sent him beef jerky in vacuum-sealed packages. He was breathing too fast, and everyone could hear it. Ramirez. Hollis didn't look at him. "Slow it down." "Yes, Sergeant." The column moved again. At the far end of the line, barely distinguishable from the others except for her smaller frame and the particular stillness with which she carried herself, walked Private Alara Voss. Nobody paid her much attention. That was, in part, by design hers. She had arrived with the rotation 3 weeks earlier, processed through like every other replacement. Paperwork, kit issue, orientation brief, handshake with the CO. She'd listed her previous unit as 3rd Infantry. Her record was clean. Her scores in basic marksmanship were listed as adequate, which was the kind of word a bureaucrat used when the numbers were good but not remarkable enough to trigger curiosity. Nobody looked twice. Hollis had looked once. He'd made the same assessment most commanders made when a new face arrived, without fanfare. Quiet, female, small, probably a logistics specialist who'd gotten shuffled into a line unit by some administrative reshuffling. He gave her the standard speech about keeping up, keeping quiet, and not making decisions above her pay grade. She had nodded once. She had not asked any questions. That, alone, should have told him something. New soldiers always ask questions. They asked about the terrain, about the rules of engagement, about where the latrines were and whether the MREs were as bad as people said. They asked because they were nervous, and nervous people filled silence with words. It was human. It was predictable. Alara Voss had not asked a single question. Now, moving through the frozen forest, she walked at the pace the column set, no more, no less. Her weapon was held at the low ready, muzzle angled at the ground, but her head was up. Her eyes weren't scanning frantically like Ramirez's. They moved in slow, deliberate arcs, pausing, returning, like she was listening with her eyes. At one point, she stopped for a fraction of a second and turned her head slightly to the left, toward a gap in the trees where wind moved differently than it should have. Then she continued walking. Nobody noticed. They reached the ridge at 0415. Hollis positioned the team behind a broken stone wall, the remnant of some structure that predated everything any of them had been born into. The ground was frozen solid. The fog below the ridge was a white ocean, featureless, impenetrable, beautiful in the way that dangerous things sometimes are. Specialist Warren Bledsoe dropped to a knee beside Alara and glanced sideways at her while he unslung his pack. "First time in the fog zone?" he asked. He wasn't trying to be friendly. He was establishing the hierarchy that new soldiers always established, the silent arithmetic of who had been here longer and therefore understood more. Alara didn't answer immediately. She was looking out at the valley. "No," she said finally. Bledsoe waited for more. Nothing came. He turned back to his own kit. Corporal James Thatcher, the team's senior rifleman and the unofficial keeper of its institutional opinion, had been watching Alara since the insertion point. He leaned toward Bledsoe and spoke beneath his breath, low enough that only the two of them could hear. "She's going to be a liability," he said. Bledsoe didn't disagree. He just shrugged and kept working. Behind them, Ramirez had his back pressed against the stone wall and his rifle clutched in both hands. His eyes were wide and moving too fast. The fog below seemed to move shapes in it that resolved into nothing when you looked directly at them. "It's just fog," said Specialist Tanya Ort, the team medic, who had the practiced calm of someone who had decided, somewhere around her 3rd deployment, That panic was a luxury item. I know, Ramirez said. He didn't sound like he knew. Alara, from her position at the end of the wall, turned her face into the wind. She was measuring it. Not consciously, not in the way that required thought. She had been measuring wind for so long that the process had dissolved into instinct, the way a musician no longer thinks about where the notes are. She felt the pressure on her left cheek, noted the faint lateral drift of the fog surface below, catalogued a dozen small atmospheric details that would have meant nothing to anyone else. Her right hand, barely visible inside her glove, rested against the grip of her rifle. It did not shake. At 0530, the fog thickened. This was not metaphor. Winter fog in this valley had a behavior pattern that anyone who had served here more than one winter understood. It built in waves, driven by temperature inversions that pooled cold air against the valley floor and trapped moisture in a dense, layered mass. The first wave came before dawn. The second came just after, heavier, lower, and colder. By the time the sky would have begun to lighten, the team on the ridge would be looking out at nothing at all. The drone operator, a young corporal named Preston Marsh, had launched the ISR platform 20 minutes earlier. Now he was watching his control screen with the concentrated misery of a man watching something expensive die slowly. "I've got nothing," he said. His voice was flat. "Thermals washing out. I'm flying blind." Hollis leaned over the screen and confirmed what Marsh was telling him. The drone's sensor feed was a smear of indistinguishable heat blobs, the fog's moisture content scattering the thermal signature of everything below into a uniform, useless glow. "Pull it back," Hollis said. "Don't waste the battery." Marsh landed the drone. Radio traffic from their attached liaison element, 2 clicks east on the adjacent ridge, had been degrading for the past hour. The valley between them acted as a natural RF sink terrain and moisture, combining to eat transmission quality. By 0545, the liaison net was producing nothing but bursts of static and occasional fragments of words that could have meant anything. "They're dark," said Specialist Kevin Darnell, the team's comms operator, pulling his headset back slightly. "I'm getting nothing reliable." Hollis absorbed this information with the stillness of a man building a problem set. He moved to the edge of the wall and stared into the white below. 7 people, 1 ridge, no drone, no reliable comms, no eyes below the fog line. And somewhere in that white ocean, the opposing force was moving. It began subtly the way everything dangerous begins. A sound that didn't fit the ambient noise profile of the valley. Not a shot, not an engine. Something softer, the specific acoustic signature of a large body of personnel moving through snow at tactical pace. The collective compression of footfall that sounds, at distance, almost like breathing. Hollis heard it. Alara had heard it several minutes before he did. Ramirez heard it and made the mistake that frightened people make in uncertain terrain. He raised his weapon. "Contact," he started. "Hold," Alara said. Her voice was quiet, not loud, not commanding in the way that sergeants were commanding, no volume, no rank authority. Just a flat, certain word that landed in the air like a stone. Ramirez froze. "There's no target," she said. "You'll give our position." Hollis turned. He was looking at her the way men looked at people who had just used a tone they hadn't been authorized to use. "Voss," he said. "The sound is echoing off the northern face," she said, still not raising her voice. "It's bouncing. They're not in front of us. They're 300 meters to the left of where he's pointing." Silence, Hollis calculated. He looked at the northern face. He listened. She was right. The math of it resolved slowly in his head. Sound bouncing geometry through the valley. The kind of battlefield acoustics that took years to internalize. He said nothing. He didn't confirm or deny. He just lowered Ramirez's weapon with one hand and repositioned the team slightly, putting more of the stone wall between them and the actual direction of the sound. 20 seconds later, a shape resolved in the fog below the ridge briefly, just long enough to be counted. A patrol element, moving exactly where Alara had said they would be. Bledsoe looked at her. She was already looking elsewhere. The patrol passed without detecting them, but it was the beginning, and everyone on the ridge knew that what had just passed was only the leading edge of something much larger. Thatcher checked his ammunition count. He did it without thinking, a reflex, the way you check a door lock twice before leaving the house. He had full magazines. It didn't make him feel better. "They're pushing the whole valley," he said, to no one in particular. "This isn't a patrol. They're running a sweep." Hollis was back on the radio, trying to reach anyone, getting static. And in the white fog below, the sound of movement continued growing, layering. spreading across the valley floor in the slow, systematic way of a force that knew exactly where it was going. By 0700, the geometry of their situation had become inescapable. The enemy force Hollis estimated a company plus based on noise signature, and the fragments of information that had come through the radio before it died completely had established a three-point cordon around the way, ridge. Not perfectly, not with the precision of a rehearsed maneuver, but well enough. The northern approach, which should have been their extraction route, was now covered. The eastern path down into the draw had been cut off sometime in the previous hour. The western face was a cliff, not a climbing cliff, but a 60-degree slope of frozen rock and compacted ice that nobody was moving down quickly. That left the ridge. That left 7 people standing on a stone wall above a valley full of fog and enemies, with no communications and no cavalry coming. Hollis laid it out flat, the way good sergeants do when they have decided that lying to their soldiers is a luxury they cannot afford. "We are surrounded on 3 sides," he said. "I cannot confirm extraction timing because I have no comms. Our options are limited." He paused. "Let that sit. We hold the ridge. We do not initiate. We wait for a window." "What window?" Thatcher asked. "Not hostile. Honest." Hollis didn't answer because there was no answer that didn't sound like fiction. Ramirez had stopped breathing fast. He had gone past fast to something worse, a held stillness that was the body's way of processing a threat level it didn't have the wiring to handle. He was sitting with his back against the stone, rifle across his knees, staring at the fog. Ort moved to him quietly. She sat beside him. She didn't say anything about breathing or about staying calm. She just sat there close enough that their shoulders touched and waited. "How many of them are there?" Ramirez asked. "Enough," Ort said, "but we're still here." He nodded. His hands were steadier. Alara, at her position at the far end of the wall, had not moved in 40 minutes. She was lying prone now. She had moved to prone sometime during the second hour, without anyone instructing her to, without explanation. Her weapon was extended. She was not looking through the optic. She was looking at the fog with her naked eyes, the way you looked at something when you were trying to see not what was there, but what was about to be there. Darnell, who had been rotating between his dead radio and the edge of the wall, found himself watching her. "Hey," he said quietly, "you're not scared." It wasn't a question. He was trying to make sense of it, running the variables, looking for the explanation. New deployment, first fog contact, enemy cordon. The math of that combination should have produced something recognizable, something that looked like the fear on Ramirez's face, or the controlled tension on Hollis's. Alara didn't look at him. "The fog will start lifting at 0830, she said. "The thermal inversion breaks when the sun angle reaches 11 degrees. We have a window of approximately 4 minutes when the lower valley will be visible and the eastern path will be exposed." Darnell stared at her. "How do you—" "4 minutes, she repeated. "We need to be ready." He turned to Hollis. Hollis had heard it. He was looking at Alara with an expression that had shifted not toward trust, not yet, but away from dismissal. "Voss," he said, "are you telling me you know the weather pattern in this valley?" She said nothing. The fog pressed in around them, white and cold and utterly silent. Then, from somewhere below, from the floor of the valley, through 200 meters of fog and frozen air came the sound of a commander's voice. Not words, cadence, the rhythmic authority of someone directing a large element, coordinating, positioning. Thatcher heard it and his jaw tightened. "They've got a commander down there. He's moving pieces." The sound of boots crunching snow multiplied. The cordon was tightening. A soldier whose name Hollis had not yet committed to memory. A private named Garrett who had arrived with Alara's rotation and had mostly existed on the periphery of the team's awareness pressed himself against the wall and said, in a voice that was trying to be a whisper and failing, "We're done. We are completely done." Nobody contradicted him. Nobody, except the woman at the end of the wall, who had gone completely still in a way that was different from stillness caused by fear. Still the way water goes still before it breaks over a dam. 0743 hours. Fog intact. Temperature, -9 Celsius. Wind from the northwest at approximately 6 kilometers per hour with a lateral drift component that most people would not have been able to quantify without instrumentation. Alara quantified it in 3 seconds by watching a single loose strand of frozen vegetation 20 meters below the ridgeline move in the cold air. She adjusted her body by approximately 2 millimeters. Her breathing slowed, not the effortful slowness of someone trying to calm down, the organic, natural slowness of a body that had learned to operate at a frequency below normal human function. Her heart rate dropped. Not because of training, not exactly. Because of years. Years of exactly this. Nobody was watching her. Hollis was at the center of the wall, pressed against the stone, scanning the fog with his NODs and getting nothing useful. Thatcher and Bledsoe were on either flank. Ort was still beside Ramirez. Darnell was at his radio, sending transmissions into silence. Marsh was sitting with his folded drone and looking at his hands. Garrett had his eyes closed. The commander's voice below had moved. It was more central now, putting the speaker somewhere near the base of the ridge's eastern approach, directing traffic, moving the cordon pieces. The voice had the confidence of someone who believed they were invisible, that the fog was their ally, that the small element on the ridge above them had no ability to respond. Alara listened to the voice for exactly 90 seconds. She triangulated it, not mathematically, not consciously, the way a musician hears a note played in another room and knows its pitch without thinking. Distance, direction, elevation relative to the ridge. The ballistic geometry formed itself in her mind like water finding its natural level. She made 3 final micro-adjustments: grip, cheek weld, natural point of aim. Exhaled. 1 shot. The sound of it was not what anyone would have expected. A rifle shot in fog-heavy air loses its sharpness, the report disperses, softens at the edges, becomes something that takes a half-second to identify as what it actually was. Some of the team heard it as a crack. Marsh heard it as a snap. Ramirez, whose eyes flew open, could not have said what he heard, just that the sound arrived and passed before his body had time to process it. Then silence. Real silence. Not the ambient noise of a valley with a company of soldiers moving through it. Actual, absolute silence, the kind that only happens when something has changed at a fundamental level. Hollis pressed his radio transmit. Got static. Pressed again. More static. Then on the enemy's frequency, which Darnell had been monitoring on a secondary channel, an eruption. Not voices. Chaos. Multiple transmissions overlapping, the specific acoustic signature of a command net that has just lost its organizing principle. Voices stepping on voices. Calls that went unanswered. The digital sound of a structure collapsing. 15 seconds later, the drone Marsh had been told to conserve battery on auto-cycled back online with its remaining charge 3 minutes of endurance. Marsh launched it reflexively, sent it below the fog ceiling at 30 meters altitude, and got 5 seconds of thermal feed before the battery ran critical. 5 seconds was enough. On the screen, a figure down, center mass. The cordon had frozen. The movement that had been systematic and organized had become a huddle of thermal signatures around a single static point. The commander, Marsh said. His voice didn't sound like his own voice. The commander is down. Hollis spun around. 7 soldiers, 7 faces, 6 pairs of eyes that were all, at that moment, asking the same question. Nobody had heard the shot come from outside the position. Nobody had seen any of the enemy fire upward at the ridge. The shot had come from here, from the ridge, from this team. Hollis looked at each face. Thatcher, Bledsoe, Ort, Darnell, Ramirez, Marsh, Garrett. Then Alara. She was lying prone, exactly where she had been. Her rifle was extended. She was looking through her optic, not at anything, just holding her position, the way a shooter holds position after the trigger breaks, because breaking position early is how you miss. She had already lowered the weapon slightly when Hollis's eyes reached her. Voss, he said. I didn't fire, she said. The cordon below did not collapse. Hollis had not expected it to. Losing a commander in the field was catastrophic but not fatal to a unit with trained NCOs, and this force had both discipline and numbers. Within 20 minutes of the single shot, the chaos on the enemy net had reorganized into something more dangerous, a controlled fury, the response of a force that had been hit and now understood it needed to find the source. But the reorganization was slower. The confidence that had been in every sound rising from the valley, the certainty of movement, the aggressive pace had fractured. The cordon pieces were still in place, but they were no longer moving. They were holding, waiting. On the ridge, the question had metastasized. I'm telling you, I saw her lower it. Bledsoe kept his voice to a murmur, but the words had the intensity of something said at full volume. He was addressing Thatcher, but not hiding the conversation from Hollis. She was in prone when the shot went. I didn't see her pull the trigger, but she was the only one in position. Thatcher ran it back. He was methodical. It was one of his few genuinely useful qualities, and he ran the scenario the way he'd been trained to process conflicting information. Check the angles. Check the positions. Eliminate the impossible. Garrett was against the wall, he said. Eyes closed. I saw that. Darnell was at the radio. Marsh was with his drone. Ort was with Ramirez. I was on the left flank. Wrong angle entirely. You were 10 meters to her right, wrong sightline. Which leaves, Bledsoe said, her, or magic. Hollis approached Alara. She was sitting now, back against the stone, rifle held vertically between her knees. Her face showed nothing recognizable. Not guilt, not satisfaction. Not the particular micro-expression of someone who had just done something extraordinary and was trying to conceal the fact. Just nothing. The kind of face you practiced for a very long time. I need to know, Hollis said. He was not accusing. He was a man who needed accurate information to make decisions, and this was information he needed to make accurate. I told you, she said. You told me you didn't fire. He crouched to her level. I believe you believe that. But the shot came from this position. It neutralized the enemy commander from a distance of at least 300 meters, in fog, and you were the only one in a shooting position. So I'm going to ask you again. I don't have anything to add, she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. She held his back with the absolute steadiness of someone who had been in this kind of eye contact before the interrogating stare, the authority pressure, and had long ago developed an immunity to it. There was something specific about her eyes that Hollis registered without being able to name. Not coldness, that wasn't right. Coldness implied absence, and absence was not what he was looking at. It was more like depth, like the particular quality of water in a very deep well, still on the surface, offering nothing to the eye, but with the suggestion of something vast and measured below it. He had seen combat veterans with that look. He had never seen it in someone listed as a private. Okay, he said finally. He stood up. He didn't push it further, because the tactical situation required his attention, and because some part of him, the part that had been watching her since the insertion point, since the sound triangulation, since the weather window prediction was beginning to assemble a picture that was not yet complete but was already profoundly unsettling. Ramirez was watching her too. He had stopped looking terrified. He was looking at her the way you looked at something you couldn't quite resolve, not the fog below, but the person next to you who was not behaving according to any pattern you had learned to recognize. Hey, he said. Alara looked at him. That shot saved us, he said, simply, without needing confirmation. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned back to the valley. Outside, the enemy was reorganizing. On the ridge, the team held position. The fog showed no signs yet of releasing the valley. The sun angle was still too low. They were still blind, still cut off, still surrounded. But the sound below had changed. The commander's voice was gone, and the silence it had left behind was a different kind of silence, not the silence of waiting, but the silence of something that had been interrupted. At 0920, the second phase began. The enemy's trained marksmen, the ones who understood that the threat on the ridge was not a surrendering element but something actively dangerous, began working the flanks. 2 shooters, at minimum, positioned in the tree lines that ran up both sides of the ridge. They were patient and methodical. They were looking for heat signature, for movement, for the silhouette of a barrel above a stone wall. Thatcher spotted the first muzzle flash, brief, suppressed, from the eastern tree line. Contact east, 350. Tree line. The shot went high, not by much. The fog was working against the enemy's accuracy as effectively as it was working against the team's, but the suppressed fire was systematic, probing, the kind of shooting done by someone who understood geometry and was working through the variables deliberately. The second shot came from the west. Different angle, different distance. This one was not probing, it was confirming, bracketing. They've got spotters, Bledsoe said. Flat, factual. And then, before anyone had fully processed the situation, the eastern marksman fired again, and the round sparked off the top edge of the stone wall, 6 inches from Darnell's left ear. Darnell went flat. His radio hit the frozen ground. His face was white in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. Okay, Thatcher said. He had been in enough contacts to recognize when the operational calculus had shifted from defensive patience to something that required a decision. They have snipers. We cannot stay above the wall. We cannot move without exposure. This position becomes untenable in approximately 10 minutes. He was right. Hollis knew he was right. There was no good option visible from where they were. Then, from the eastern tree line, the marksman fired a third time. And a fourth, systematic, patient, working the wall section by section, walking the fire toward the team's positions. And then the eastern marksman stopped firing. Just stopped. Mid-pattern, no follow-on shot, nothing. 11 seconds later, the western marksman stopped as well. not simultaneously with a gap. 11 seconds apart. Bledsoe heard it first. The absence. The specific, distinct absence of something that had been there and was no longer there. They're not. They're down, Thatcher said. He said it quietly, the way you said a thing you couldn't fully believe. None of us fired. Hollis's voice had a quality in it that had not been there before. Something adjusting, something recalculating. He turned to look down the wall at the end of the position. Illyra's position was empty. She had moved. Sometime in the last 4 minutes with no one observing. During the chaos of the incoming fire, she had repositioned. Her empty spot at the end of the wall told nothing about where she had gone. Then Darnell, who had gone to the northernmost corner of the wall to retrieve a piece of his radio kit, stood up slowly. He stopped. He pointed, not at anything they could see clearly, just toward the tree line on the opposite side of the ridge, where the ground dropped away. She's out there. Nobody moved. Both of them, Darnell said, in 4 minutes, through the fog. She took them both out. Marsh sat down on the frozen ground. That's not possible, Garrett said. He said it without heat, without denial, even. He said it as a statement about physics, as if the statement of impossibility would trigger some correction in reality. Thatcher did not sit down. He stood at the wall and looked at the empty position and at the edge of the ridge where Darnell was pointing and said, very quietly, "There's a name. For someone who shoots like that." Nobody asked him what name. The fog pressed in around them, cold and close. "Old story," Thatcher continued. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the tree line. 5 years ago, northern sector, there was a sniper, one of ours. She ran 12 confirmed kills in a single winter op. Longest shots anyone had on record for those conditions. Then he paused, disappeared. No discharge papers, no transfer orders. She just stopped being in the system. Bledsoe had gone very still. What was her name? Thatcher didn't answer immediately. They called her the ghost in the white fog, he said. The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't ask questions. It just settles like snow. She came back over the ridge edge at 0957. She moved the way she'd moved at insertion, without hurry, without announcement, without the particular body language of someone returning from something remarkable. She resumed her position at the end of the wall and reset her gear with the small, precise movements of someone who had done the same actions so many times they had become mechanical. Hollis waited. Thatcher waited. Everyone waited. Illyra said nothing. "Ghost in the white fog," Thatcher said, finally. He said it looking at the valley, not at her. The phrase hung in the cold air. She didn't respond. "I was in northern sector," he said. "Second winter rotation. There was a briefing. I was a junior NCO. I only got the summary. But there was a shooter who took out a command element in a condition 0 fog. Range estimated at 800 meters. 1 round. No spotter. No second shot." He paused. The assessment team said the shot was not reproducible under normal human performance parameters. They actually wrote that. Not reproducible under normal human performance parameters. Illyra was looking at the valley. The file went classified. Thatcher continued. The shooter went dark. Officially, she was listed as transferred to a training command that nobody could locate. But the story went around the way stories go around in this life. Always the same details. The fog, the distance, the silence. He paused. He was back in the briefing room 5 years ago. The summary he'd read while half asleep after 40 hours on rotation. He remembered the number. 800 meters. He remembered the phrase "not reproducible under normal human performance parameters." He remembered thinking, at the time, that whoever wrote that phrase had chosen it carefully, not because they doubted the outcome, but because they doubted their ability to explain it in terms that the record-keeping system was designed to accommodate. Some things happened that weren't supposed to happen. The official solution was not to deny them, but to classify them, put them somewhere that regular paperwork couldn't reach. Let the story circulate in canteen conversations and quiet debriefs, and the particular oral tradition that combat units maintained in parallel with their official documentation, the stories that survived because the people who lived them couldn't stop telling them, even when they couldn't tell them officially. He turned to look at her, directly, for the first time. "Your name isn't Voss, is it?" he said. Not a question. The fog below was beginning to thin barely. The sun angle was climbing. By 10:30 there would be a window in the lower valley, exactly as she had predicted. "My name is whatever the roster says it is," she said. Ramirez was watching her with a kind of open wonder that he wasn't bothering to conceal. 19 years old, from Tucson. With a sister who sent beef jerky, he had never been in a situation that felt like this one. Like standing next to something that was simultaneously ordinary and impossible. "Why?" Hollis asked. She turned to look at him. "Why are you here?" he clarified. "If you're who I think you might be. Why are you here as a private, with a team like this, in a rotation that you're—" He stopped. He didn't have a clean end to the sentence. "Because the mission was here," she said. It was not an answer that explained anything. It was an answer that explained everything. Hollis recognized it as belonging to a very specific category, the kind of answer given by someone who had been doing a thing so long and had stripped away so many layers of justification and narrative around that thing that what remained was just the fact of it. The mission was here, so she was here. He nodded. He didn't push further. On the enemy's frequency, Darnell was hearing something new. Not chaos, the chaos phase had passed. What replaced it was quieter and more dangerous. The methodical communication of a force that had assessed its situation and was now deploying a specific response. "They're calling up a precision element," Darnell said. "My translation is rough, but they're bringing in their own top shooter. Maybe more than one." Hollis looked at Alara. Alara looked at the valley. "How many?" she asked Darnell. "3. Maybe 4. She was quiet for a long moment. "Then we need to move first," she said. She gave the order quietly. That was what none of them would forget afterward, not the content of it, but the register. Not the authority of rank or volume, the authority of certainty. "Thatcher, move your element to the north corner of the wall. Bledsoe, you go prone at the break in the stone, center right. Ort, keep Ramirez and Garrett low, and back 10 meters behind the wall." She looked at Hollis. "With your permission." He looked at her for a moment. Then, "Do it." They moved, not questioning. The quality of her voice had triggered something, not obedience exactly. Orientation, like compasses aligning to a field. She repositioned herself to the eastern edge of the ridge, not behind the wall, out in front of it on the exposed slope, in a position that should have been suicidal. She went prone on the frozen ground, used the slight depression of a rock shelf as a firing support, and became as still as the landscape around her. "She's outside the cover," Bledsoe said, not alarmed, reporting. "She knows what she's doing," Thatcher said, quietly, like a man changing his mind about something he'd already decided. The enemy precision element arrived at 1045, emerging from separate positions: the northeastern tree line, the southern ridge approach, and a position on the opposite valley face that required a range estimation of over 900 meters in reduced visibility. They were good. They were patient. They moved into their positions with the deliberate quiet of people who understood their trade. And they had been positioned for 40 seconds, when the first of them was removed from the equation. Ilara's shot crossed 930 meters of fog-filtered air, accounting for the Coriolis effect that, at that range, added a lateral component most shooters at any level of training failed to calculate correctly. It was, objectively, one of the more extraordinary pieces of marksmanship ever executed in those conditions, but she did not appear to experience it as extraordinary. She ran the problem. She solved the problem. She moved on. 4 seconds. Second position. 700 meters. The fog here was slightly thinner, which should have made it easier, but in fact created its own optical distortions, the human eye tending to resolve apparent shapes in the fog and firing at them rather than at the actual target. She fired at the actual target. 9 seconds. Third position. 850. The shooter here had gotten a shot off. It went into the ridgeline 2 meters to her left and threw frozen chips of rock across the ground. She adjusted for the new information the shot had given her about the shooter's position, ran the correction in under 2 seconds, and fired. 11 seconds later, the fourth position, which she had identified but not yet engaged, went dark on its own. The fourth shooter had seen 3 colleagues removed in 24 seconds and had made the rational decision that continuing to operate was not compatible with survival. He withdrew. Ilara stayed prone for 40 more seconds, watching, waiting. Then she rose and walked back to the wall. 7 soldiers stared at her. Darnell had his mouth slightly open. Marsh had both hands flat on the ground in front of him like a man trying to establish that the ground was still solid. Hollis said, "Who are you?" She picked up her gear. She checked the chamber of her weapon with the same mechanical precision she checked it every time. Not because she doubted the weapon, but because she had never stopped doing it, not in all the years she'd been doing it. She did not answer. But Thatcher answered for her. He said it so quietly it was almost not said at all. "She's the ghost." At 1115, the enemy committed their reserve. It was a logical decision. They had lost a commander, lost a precision element, and lost cohesion in their cordon, but they still had overwhelming numbers, and they still had the ridge surrounded. The rational response was mass. Throw enough force at the problem that individual excellence becomes irrelevant. 2 platoon strength elements began moving up the ridge simultaneously, eastern and western approaches, converging. The fog was thinning at the valley floor but still dense on the slopes, which meant the advancing force would be invisible until it was very close. Hollis heard the movement and ran the arithmetic fast. We cannot hold this position. 60+ combatants on 2 approaches. Fog cover. No fire support. No, we don't need to hold it, Alara said. He looked at her. We need 8 minutes, she said. The window opens at 1,127. The eastern path drops 22 meters in the first 100, which the fog will clear first. If we're moving when the window opens, we're out. 8 minutes against 60. 7 minutes, she said. And we don't fight them, we blind them. She explained it in 40 words, no more. The plan was not complex. Complexity was a liability when time was the limiting factor. It was simple, and it was brutal, and it required her to stand in the open long enough to do something that she would describe later, if she described it at all, as the long problem. She took position on the highest point of the ridge, not behind stone, not in a depression, on top, exposed from 3 directions. At this point, in this light, against this fog, she was essentially visible against the sky to anything looking upward from the slope. She was counting on that. The advancing elements saw her. Of course they did. She was a silhouette on a ridgeline, outlined against the pale winter sky. The rational response was to engage. Both elements began directing fire upward. Suppressive, heavy, the specific sound of a force that had been frustrated and was now releasing that frustration through velocity and volume. She did not move. She was working. Each shot she fired went into a specific position in the fog, not at targets she could see, but at the geometry of where targets had to be given the terrain, the approach routes, the pace of advance, and the particular noise profile of soldiers who were under fire and accelerating. She was reading the shape of the problem. She was shooting at the future, at where the threat would be by the time the round arrived. Ramirez was counting. He could not help it. It was something he needed to do. He counted 9 shots in 90 seconds. He counted the silences between them, the precise intervals that were neither panicked nor mechanical, but something in between, something organic and calibrated. 9, he said, softly, not to anyone. On the eastern approach, the advance slowed. Not stopped, but slowed. Fractured. The specific loss of momentum that happens when an element loses 4 or 5 of its leading elements in rapid succession, and the soldiers behind them start performing their own arithmetic about what comes next. The western approach was still moving, fast. Alara heard them. She had been tracking their sound since before they started climbing, since the moment the reserve committed, because that was what you did when you understood that the battle was a problem and the problem was solvable if you gathered the right data before you needed it. She turned to the western approach, fired twice, fast, faster than the intervals before, because the margin was thin and getting thinner. The sounds on the western slope reorganized, not stopped, but reorganized. 1,124, Darnell said. He had his watch in his hand. He was staring at it with the intensity of a man for whom the watch had become the most important object in the world. Move, Alara said. They moved. She fired twice more as they ran covering, without looking at her team, without confirming they were moving, because she already knew they were moving, because she had told them to move, and she had assessed, correctly, that Hollis was the kind of leader who executed when someone with better information gave a clear order. The fog on the eastern path broke at 1,127, exactly as she had predicted. A corridor of relative visibility opened narrow, temporary, and absolutely real. Hollis took the team through it at full sprint. Ramirez, who had been terrified for 6 hours and was now running on something that had moved past terror into a clarity he had never experienced before, ran without stumbling. Ort ran. Darnell ran. Thatcher, who was the last to accept the situation and was now fully inside it, ran with the purposeful sprint of a man who had revised his entire understanding of what was possible. Behind them, 2 shots from Alara's position, and then she was running too. Not before them, alongside. She was running, and she was not looking back. The eastern path dropped 22 meters in the first 100, into a draw that the fog filled thickly, and in the fog they were invisible. They ran through the draw and up the far side and over the tree line and onto the extraction route that had been closed for 4 hours but was now open because the force that had been holding it was no longer organized enough to hold anything. They ran until Hollis called the halt. 7 people. 7 people breathing hard in the cold air, chest heaving, visible breath making clouds that dissolved in the winter morning. 7 people alive in a forest that 2 hours ago had seemed like the last place any of them would see. Hollis bent with his hands on his knees. He was not a man who showed exhaustion easily. He was showing it now. Bledsoe was the one who said it out loud, not because he was the most perceptive of them, but because he was the most honest in the way that sometimes goes hand in hand with a complete inability to process subtlety. He straightened up from where he'd been bent against a tree, looked across the group and said, "I've been in this work for 8 years. I've never seen anything like that. Not once." He wasn't addressing anyone specifically, just releasing it, the way pressure needed to be released. 900 meters, in the fog. The first one didn't even get a shot off. Nobody contradicted him. Nobody embellished it either. The moment was too fresh for that, too close to the edge of what they'd just come through. It needed a little distance before it would become a story. Right now it was still just fact, and fact was already extraordinary enough. After 30 seconds he straightened. He looked at his team. He counted them. He looked at Alara. She was standing, not bent. Her breathing was elevated. She was human, after all, but controlled. She was looking back in the direction they had come from, not with fear, with the specific attention of someone who was not finished evaluating a problem until she confirmed it was actually finished. Then she looked at the team, and for the first time since insertion, she allowed something into her expression, not warmth. Exactly, something that was adjacent to warmth. The thing that happened to a face when a person acknowledged that the people around them had done something that mattered. She held it for about 2 seconds. Then it was gone. Like the fog burning off a ridgeline present, real, undeniable, and then simply not there anymore. No gradual fading, just the shift from one state to the other, with nothing in between. Ramirez watched the place where the expression had been. He was going to think about that for a long time, the 2 seconds when the architecture of something composed entirely of control had opened slightly, like a door that had been sealed for years, cracking just enough to let in a sliver of light, and then closed again. He would not be able to describe it to anyone who hadn't been there. He would try once, in a letter to his sister, and delete what he wrote because the words came out wrong, too small for the thing they were trying to hold. The extraction came at 1,340, a vehicle element that had been waiting on a route 3 clicks west, stalled by the same comms blackout that had isolated the team. When the radio came back at 1,310 and Darnell got through on the first clear transmission, the extraction was already moving. The debrief happened at a forward operating element, a prefab structure with inadequate heating and a long folding table, and a captain who looked like he had been awake for 30 hours and was managing it with the practiced professionalism of someone who had learned to treat exhaustion as background noise. Hollis sat at one end of the table. His team sat along the sides. He gave the account factual, sequential, precise. He described the cordon, the comms blackout, the loss of drone capability, the enemy commander, the precision element, the final assault. He described it accurately. When he reached the part about the engagement actions, he described what had happened without identifying who had done what. He listed the outcomes. Enemy commander neutralized, enemy precision element removed, advance elements suppressed, successful extraction. The captain looked up from his notes at that point. Hollis. Who ran these engagements? Hollis paused. He had been thinking about this moment since the extraction vehicle. He had been turning it over the answer, and what it meant, and what it would do. Unidentified team action, he said. Fog conditions made individual attribution difficult. The captain looked at him for a long moment. He looked down the table at the team. He looked at the space where Alara had been sitting. She was no longer there. Sometime in the previous 20 minutes, between the vehicle arriving at the compound and the debrief beginning, she had not arrived at the table. "Where is Private Voss?" the captain asked. Nobody answered immediately. Then Thatcher said, without inflection, "She stepped out. I can take a message." The captain studied the table. He was not a fool, that was evident. He was running his own arithmetic. Hollis could see it. But he also understood, in the way that officers who had been around long enough understood, that some arithmetic did not need to be completed. He looked down at his notes. He wrote something. He moved on. After the debrief, Hollis went outside. The compound was a rectangle of prefab and sandbag in a cleared area that had once been something else, farmland. Maybe, before the events that made farmland in this region a secondary consideration. The sky had cleared. The winter afternoon was coming on, blue-gray at the edges, the sun already moving toward the western ridgeline. No fog, just cold, clean air and the sound of wind in the tree line. He walked the perimeter. He was looking. He already knew what he would find when he looked. He found it at the eastern gate, a set of boot prints in the mud at the gate's edge, where the compound wall met the access road. The prints went outward. They did not return. Hollis stood at the gate for a long time. Thatcher found him there 10 minutes later. He stood beside him and looked at the prints. Then he looked at the tree line beyond the road. Then he looked at the sky. She was never going to stay, Thatcher said. If we'd known who she was at insertion, we would have treated her differently, Hollis said. Which is why she didn't tell us. That sat in the air between them. The file will come up, Thatcher said. When they process the action report, when they run the personnel through the system, someone will notice. Someone will notice she was never here, Hollis said. The paperwork will resolve itself. It always does, with her. 5 years and no one's found the pattern yet. The ghost in the white fog, Thatcher said. He didn't say it with awe. He said it with something more complicated, the particular tone of a person who has been close to something extraordinary and is trying to find the right relationship to the experience. Not worship, not disbelief. Something in the middle. Recognition. Inside, Ramirez was at a table with a cup of coffee that he wasn't drinking. He was looking at his hands. Ort sat across from him. She was watching him with her medic's eye assessing. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah." He looked up. "Do you believe it? The story?" "I believe what I saw," she said. "I counted 9 shots in 90 seconds, he said. And she wasn't scared. Like not even a little. I kept waiting for it and it never came. Some people are like that." "No," he said. "No, they're not. I've never seen anyone like that." Ort considered this. She picked up her own coffee. "Maybe that's why they make her a legend instead of just a soldier," she said. "Because it's easier to understand." Ramirez looked at his hands again. He turned them over, palms up, then down. "She saved us," he said. "And now she's just gone." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the thin wall of the prefab, the wind moved through the compound and on into the tree line and beyond that into the valley where the fog was thinning as the day died. The cold was coming back, the overnight cold, denser, heavier than the morning variety. By midnight, the valley would be white again. By midnight, she would be somewhere else. Another rotation, another unit that had never heard her name, another roster that would list her as adequate, until the fog came. At 1,800, the debrief concluded, and the captain filed his after-action summary. The summary noted the successful extraction of Bravo fire team from an encircled position under adverse visibility conditions. It noted the neutralization of an enemy command element and a precision shooting team. It attributed the outcomes to effective team coordination and adaptability under pressure. It did not include a name. In the classified annex that the captain added separately and flagged for restricted distribution, he noted one thing: the ballistic data from the recovered rounds in enemy territory, submitted by the forensics element that cleared the valley that afternoon, showed signature patterns consistent with a legacy file, a pattern documented once before, 5 years ago, in the northern sector. He added a note: "Pattern confirmed. Asset still active. Do not pursue." He filed it. He locked it. He went back to his coffee. Somewhere east of the compound, beyond the road and the tree line and the frozen creek that ran parallel to the old farm track, a figure moved through the last of the afternoon light. The snow was clean there, untouched, undisturbed. No boot prints until she made them, and even those she minimized. Light step, lateral weight distribution, the decades-old habit of leaving as little evidence of passage as possible. Old habit, necessary habit. The fog was gone for now. She could see the ridgeline she'd spent the morning on, dark against the sky. She could see the valley floor, cleaner without the white sea that had covered it all day. She could see where the approaches ran and where the cordon had been, and the specific point on the eastern slope where the advance had stalled. She looked at it for a moment. Not long. Then she shouldered her pack and walked east, into the diminishing light, toward whatever came next. The valley behind her went quiet. The snow held her last prints for 40 minutes. Then the wind came down off the high ground and moved across the surface, in long, slow sweeps, and the prints filled in, and the valley was clean again, as if no one had been there. as if no one had stood on that ridge in the fog and done something that the official record would describe as team coordination, and that the soldiers who had been there would describe, quietly, in the years that followed, in the specific way that people described things they had witnessed but couldn't entirely account for. There was a woman. She was the last one in line. Nobody looked at her twice. And then the fog came. And then she showed us what she was. Legends don't die. They just stop being visible until the fog comes back.